Hello and welcome to the Third Sector podcast. I am Dami Adewale.
And I'm Lucinda Rouse. Each week we bring you half an hour of discussion and debate about the important goings-on in the charity world. And this week we're joined by Acevo's Chief Executive, Jane Ide. If you're not aware, Acevo stands for the Association of Chief Executives of Voluntary Organisations. In other words, it exists to support the leaders of charities and social enterprises in England and Wales. Jane, welcome.
Thank you. Delighted to be here with you.
What's it like to be at the head of an organisation that supports the sector's leaders right now?
I love my job. I have to say that people always look at me slightly, raised eyebrow when I say this. I've been here 3.5 years now, and I absolutely love this role. I love the work we do at Acevo. It's a really, really good organisation. I inherited a great organisation. It is a very, very impactful and dynamic and ambitious organisation. We are here to help our members have the greatest impact they can have, and that sits at the heart of everything we do, and that's why we exist. But I think also, especially in the context of what it's like to lead in our sector now, I'm really proud of the fact, I'm really glad of the fact that we are here and that we exist and that we do what we do so well, because I know from my own experience as a chief exec prior to coming here and the experience of our 1,700 members who talk to us a lot about what they're dealing with, it's so important to have that support network, to have those peers around you that can help you and that can guide you and that can share advice and share experience, and just have somebody to say, actually, you're not on your own. And that's where Acevo came from. We were founded nearly 40 years ago by 3 or 4 chief execs who got together, I gather in a pub, in the way you would expect, and said, this is a tough gig. How do we help each other? And that's the beating heart of what Acevo is all about.
It's wonderful to hear that you love the work. I wonder, over the space of the past 3 and a bit years that you've been with Acevo, how have the demands or needs of your members changed?
In a way, I'm not sure they have changed that much in that period of time. I came in 2022, the very tail end, or that long tail, if you like, of the pandemic. And I think everybody would see that was a particular watershed moment for the sector. There's the pre-pandemic world of being a chief executive and the post-pandemic world. What we have seen very clearly over the last 3.5 years is the ongoing unquestionable pressure that there is on our sector. And I think I go back to my point, 40 years ago, clearly there were pressures on the sector, otherwise those chief execs wouldn't have got together in the way that they did. And I think there's always been that challenge of there's never enough money, there's never enough resilience in the system, all those sorts of things. And I think that is probably very true. But one of the things that I talk about quite a lot is I think the context in which people are now leading is very, very different. The speed, the pace of change, the pace of challenge, that sense, particularly I think for a leader, that you are always on. You're always under scrutiny, whether that's from your stakeholders or your board or your staff or your beneficiaries or just the world at large. And I think that's inevitably, I hate to talk about social media in the sort of cliche terms, but I think that's clearly a big part of it that's changed. And I think that general sense of disruption and fragmentation and tension that I think have been felt by so many organisations in so many different contexts, not just within our sector over the last 3.5 years, that really impacts on what leaders are feeling. And so what that means for us at Acevo is that we have seen an ongoing increase in demand year on year on year for our direct support services. We are known, very well known in the sector, I'm very glad to say, for the support that we can provide to individual chief executives when they're facing some real challenges, whether that's support with their governance or whether it's just being a good listening ear and a sounding board, or sadly sometimes when people are in a real crisis situation. And the demand for those services has risen by over 100% in the last 2.5 years.
Wow.
Exactly. Wow, indeed. But at the same time, the other thing that I've been seeing, particularly over the last couple of years, is when people have been saying, actually, I don't think I can do this job anymore. I'm not going to renew my membership because I'm leaving. I'm stepping away from the sector. I'm stepping away from being a chief executive. That's given us some cause for concern and still gives me cause for concern. But I think we are a sector of problem solvers. That's why the sector exists. We see that there's a problem, we want to find a way to fix it. And what I've started to see a lot more of over the last 12 months, which gives me real hope, is smart, forward-thinking, really intelligent leaders saying, okay, the leadership role is not sustainable in the way it used to be, but it still needs to be done. So how are we going to do it differently? And I'm hearing lots of different conversations. There's a massive interest in co-chief exec roles and how to make that work. And of course, there's many different variations on that theme. But every time we do any sort of workshop or event or have a speaker talking about it, we always get a real interest in that. So I think that's one big area of shift. I'm hearing chief executives and their leadership teams and their boards talking about maybe we ought to have a deputy chief exec role when we've never had one before. Maybe we ought to have a chief operating officer role when we've never had one before. Even if we're a small organisation and it's always been seen as a bit of, well, that's what the big guys do. Actually, we do need to understand that there's more to the leadership role than is perhaps sustainable for one person. I'm hearing a lot of interest again in different ways of planning your working life. So whether that's as an individual working on compressed hours or going to a part-time role, or as an organisation, a lot of interest in 4-day week trials and all of those sort of different ways of working. And I think it's a little bit like, it's very much like we saw in the post-pandemic world, where we had that whole sort of disruptive phase of, are we going to work in an office? Are we not going to work in an office? Which is better? What do we lose? What do we gain? And my response to that was always, you can only do what's right for your organisation. I suspect we are seeing, in a slightly less noisy way, but I think a really potentially very impactful way, that range of different approaches that will make it more possible for leaders to go on leading, and even more importantly, for those organisations to go on being led successfully in ways that will be different for every organisation and every context that they're in. And I think that's a really exciting thing. But one of the things I've been talking about recently is, I think when anybody goes into a new job, they have a horizon point. You know, I usually go into a new role and I usually stay there for 6 years or 10 years or 5 years or whatever it is. And I think we have to be realistic now and say, if you thought your horizon point was 10 years, it's probably now more likely 7 or 8. And if it was 8, it's probably more like 5 or 6, because that pressure is not sustainable. And we don't want people to be put in that position where they are unable to go on leading, because it's obviously not good for them, and nor is it good for the organisation. So that's a big part of what we've been looking at and thinking about, and doing our part to try and help people think those things through. First of all, that immediate support to help people at that moment of challenge, but also, very, very importantly, to help our leaders, whose job it is to think strategically about the role of leadership in the sector, and really encouraging boards to think about that as well.
What is your view on the co-chief executive model? Have you seen it working in more instances than not?
Yes, I think I would say so. I think it's a relationship, and it's like any other relationship. You have to put a lot of time and energy and thought into how it's going to work, really surfacing unspoken assumptions. There are so many different ways of doing it. So I've seen people who literally come as a matched pair, and, you know, they will apply for their next role together and then the next one after that. And interestingly, I've seen a lot of that happening with people who either currently or have worked in the civil service together. I think there's been a long tradition in the civil service of doing that. So people have moved out of that into our world. I think there are some cases where maybe an existing chief executive has said, actually, I don't want to carry on doing this in that way. Let's think about this as a way of sort of providing continuity. And I think that's a really interesting piece of succession planning of, I'm going to step away in X number of years' time, but I don't want everything to just sort of start. So let's bring somebody in who can take over. And I've seen others where individuals who've been working within the organisation, and there's a perfect example at our friends at Charity Finance Group, where Claire and Sarah have recently stepped into that co-chief exec role, having previously been co-deputy chief executives, and having originally both of them gone there as individuals in their own roles, and it being identified as part of their development process and as part of the organisation's succession planning that this actually was a great way organisation to move forward. So again, I don't think there's a one size fits all, but I think it has to be right for the organisation. It has to be right for the individuals. You have to think really hard about those relationships. I think it can potentially get a little tricky between co-chief execs and chairs, and we have seen some of that occasionally.
Ganging up against the chair.
Well, not necessarily, but no, I wouldn't quite put it like that. But I think, again, just that clarity of who's responsible for what. Who's the chair holding accountable for this and who's the chair holding accountable for that? And equally, the flip of that, I think, is true for staff teams. Staff teams need to understand who's doing what. Some co-chief execs, it's literally we both do everything and they make that work. Others, it's she does the finance and the HR, he does the stakeholder engagement and the fundraising, or whatever it is it might be. Again, I'm very agnostic about what is the right model, because I think it has to be the right thing for that organisation at that time and not necessarily in perpetuity.
And Jane, you've spoken just in terms of your relationships, the relationships that you have with your members and just alleviating pressure off leaders. Another way that can be done is through support from the government. So I just wanted to speak about the civil society covenant at the moment and how it's being monitored. And if anyone doesn't know what it is, if you could briefly explain what it is.
I suspect quite a lot of people still don't know what it is because it's still very early days in some ways. For me, the journey towards the covenant actually began when I first came into the sector, which is way back before the pandemic, when I was Chief Executive of NAVCA, which is the national membership body for local CVSs. And I remember really clearly my first week in that role, having never worked in the sector before, somebody said, oh yeah, the compact, and they rolled their eyes. And then somebody said, oh yeah, the compact, and they rolled their eyes. And I thought, oh, okay, so the compact obviously isn't great. But then as I was going out and meeting NAVCA members who were working at very local level, working with their very local communities, I was hearing a different story. And they were saying the compact has been amazing for us. We've really used it to build the relationships with our local commissioners, with local health services and so on and so forth. Please don't let anybody take it away. So I thought, okay, there's a disconnect here. And then over the years, as I learned more about it and as I obviously got to know the sector better, and particularly, I think, over the last 4 or 5 years, that recognition for me that there was something missing, that we'd lost that sort of framework for a relationship between our sector and government in all of its forms, and I don't just mean central government. And so I and a few others who were thinking along similar lines, we started talking about the need for a revised version, something that would create a set of principles, a shared foundation that said, this is what our sector is here for, this is how we work, this is how government will work with us. And we started those conversations, honestly, long before the election last year. And it was landing with everybody on all different parties that we talked to. There was clearly a recognition that there was some value in this. Spinning forward to the first few months of the Labour government and through to the summer of this year, a lot of work behind the scenes to really try and interrogate what those principles should be and how they could be made to work in a context with a government that had said very clearly, right from the publication of their manifesto, right the way through to very early days from number 10, talking very, very positively about the need for our sector to be part of this mission-led government, part of this intention to deliver change. The covenant itself was published in July, actually, I forget now the exact date. And I have to say it was launched at a really strikingly powerful event led by the Prime Minister. I lost count of how many secretaries of state and ministers were there in the room, senior civil servants. There was a real sense of commitment and determination. And we heard some great speakers from across government in various ways talking about how they felt that relationship was so crucial. And the covenant is not the relationship. The covenant is a framework for a relationship. It's a starting point where you need it. The real foundation of all of this is that there does seem to be that determination at the heart of government that the sector needs to be part of the bigger picture, which is something we've missed out on a bit, it has to be said, over the years. In terms of where the covenant is now, we're expecting that there will be a joint council to have some governance oversight of it, and we're just awaiting I think we're close to it, but we're not there yet. Some news from inside government as to how that's going to be put together. And I think once that's in place and we know who's sitting on that council, who's chairing it, how it's working, how often it's meeting, where it's meeting, all those sorts of things, who's going to be involved from government or civil service and so on, then I think it'll be a lot clearer about how we can hold each other to account. Because that was always one of the key principles that was agreed, that it's not one way. Government wants to know that we are standing by our side of the bargain, so to speak. We obviously want to know that government is standing by their side of the bargain. But in real terms, for me, the really important value of having the covenant in place, with all due respect, is not that the Prime Minister will stand up on the steps of Number 10 and say, this is what we're doing. Hugely appreciated though that is. It's how it gets worked in ordinary, boring meeting rooms when people from our sector are meeting with people from government in Westminster, in local authority, and having the really practical conversations about how we work together. In a previous life, I was a civil servant myself, and I can tell you, you rely on your stakeholders to tell you what is going on elsewhere in government. That doesn't get shared very easily. It's a very unwieldy beast to communicate with. But if a stakeholder from our side of the fence, so to speak, can go into a meeting room and say, you probably don't know about this, but let me explain to you what the covenant is. Let me show you what it says. Let's sit down or let's work out together where this is really relevant for us, and let's work on that together. There's a danger of people waiting for it to happen as though somebody at the centre is going to pull a big lever and that's going to make it work. That's not what's going to make it work. It's going to work when the local adoption charity or the local domestic violence charity or people who are looking to influence what happens in social prescribing, or all of those things that are happening in lots of different rooms, in lots of different contexts, are actually going in and making it real.
But it's very important to have that monitoring mechanism, isn't it? To see, is progress being made? Is it not? If not, what do we need to change in order to see it?
Yes.
So it all rests on this council?
Well, we believe so. And I think the work of the council has got to be about actually establishing those principles and making them real, testing them, making sure that things are happening, being a place for people to say, well, actually, we went and had this conversation with X department and it didn't work and it didn't sit with the principles of the covenant, and, what are you going to do about it? And I think one of the things we've got to be looking for as a sector, and certainly those of us that have been involved in this work, is to really scrutinise what does come out around the council, where it's got teeth, where it hasn't got teeth, where it's not meant to have teeth perhaps, and how impactful it can really be in that context. I think as well, though, there is a danger, and I'm not here as in any way to be a spokesperson for the government in any way, shape or form, obviously, but I think there is a danger that there's a little bit of an assumption that because we're not seeing things happening, they're not already happening. And I know certainly of a couple of examples, things that have been happening probably since before the covenant was actually launched, but on the basis that these conversations were being started, that this matters to government and so on. There's been some very interesting work, which I think is probably going to be coming to fruition very soon, if it hasn't already, around the Cabinet Office and the model grant funding agreements. And also we, Acevo, NCBO and CFG are now in regular meetings with the Treasury. Now, neither of those things are headline grabbing. They're certainly not worthy of a press release necessarily, but they're really important for our sector. And it's that sort of level of detailed, almost bureaucratic work that I think we can start to see some real shifts, as well as the opportunities for those in our sector who are real experts in their areas, whether it's homelessness, whether it's immigration, whether it's domestic violence, whatever it is, to actually be able to not just go in and have those conversations, but be treated as really valued partners in the development of policy, which is the other part of it that we're obviously hoping for out of all of this.
So if one of your members who perhaps hasn't been involved in any of those bureaucratic conversations or processes saying, hang on a minute, this was signed in July, we haven't seen a great deal of progress yet, what is going on? Obviously not helped by the fact that the government is in mild disarray at the moment anyway.
You might say that, I couldn't possibly comment. Yes.
What would you say to them? Hold your horses.
I would completely appreciate and understand a sense of frustration. Whether or not I would share any frustration myself, I couldn't possibly comment. I'm certainly hearing from the conversations I've had with people within government, within the civil service, some shared frustration. And I think that's the reality of where we're at. Nothing has quite moved quite as fast as a lot of us would have liked. But I do believe that there is a real will there to move things forward. And I think we should expect to see more momentum coming in the next few weeks, months, certainly in the first quarter of 2026. I'll be honest, and I will happily say this, I think if there isn't, then we do have to be asking questions. And we are obviously asking, we're pressing the movement all the time. We don't take our foot off the pedal on that.
Moving on to a different area now, but still looking at the state of the world, or at least the state of this country, we are seeing increased polarisation in society, and it's inevitable that charities, particularly working at the local community level, will be on the front line of that.
Yes.
I wonder how your members, appreciate that's a very generalised question, are sort of coping with the current state of play, and also what you see the role of Acevo and other infrastructure organisations being in convening civil society in this age of polarisation.
I think, well, first of all, you're right. Things have become much more polarised than they have been for a very long time in my lifetime, I would say. And yes, there's no question that for many of our members, that's creating some very real challenges. And I see it almost like a group of concentric circles. That I think at the heart of it are those who are leading refugee migrant charities who are literally having to put in place police protections, alarms, send people home from their offices, protect people when they're working, all of those things. And one of the conversations I've had with leaders in that context is their deep frustration at how much time and energy and finance they're having to divert from the core work in order to deal with those issues. And I think that's a bit of a recurring theme in a number of different ways. So those individuals and those individual organisations, along with others, we're very acutely aware of the need to provide support in whatever way we can. And I think it's been very interesting that, I know the Charity Commission has held roundtables, has taken action to take trustee names off the website, those sorts of things, because I think we're very, very acutely aware of the very real physical and emotional risks that are being held in those spaces. I think then there are leaders who are telling me that even though their charities don't operate directly in that space, their staff are also being abused, being spat at, perhaps in the charity shops, because they provide services to people, some of whom may be refugees or migrants, or they're seen in that way. And that's a challenge. I think there are very few leaders who won't have staff who are directly or personally affected in some way by that rise in racist rhetoric. And then I think there's another element which is perhaps less well known, but also a real challenge for many leaders in our sector, which is where the polarisation isn't just something that's happening outside in the wider world, but is happening within their organisations, where you've got staff groups who have differing views, who perhaps are feeling those tensions and pressures in a way that perhaps in the past weren't quite so heightened. And the challenges that can bring to anybody leading an organisation where you really need everybody kind of pointing in the same direction, and actually energy and challenge is going into that disparity between what people believe, what they feel, how they're expressing it, how they feel able to express it, and so on. So there's many, many different levels to this. And I think around all of that is, again, we're a sector of leaders who, generally speaking, we're in this work to make the world a better place. I have been very, very struck, particularly over the last couple of months, and I think particularly, rightly or wrongly, I link it to the party conference season, where things became even more heightened to, social media campaigns to go out and put flags up, all of those sorts of things. There was certainly a period of about a month where every conversation I had with anybody in our sector, within seconds, it was around this issue and what are we going to do about it? How do we help this country, our culture, to be more unified, to be a safer place, to be the place we all want it to be, that values-led culture, I guess. And I think, obviously some of our sector leaders are very much working in that space as well. So I think there's a number of different areas and there's a number of different ways into it. I think one of the things as a membership organisation, and as an organisation that has a bird's eye view, if you like, of the sector, we also have to think very carefully and clearly, shall we say, perhaps more than carefully, about what is it that only we can do. We can't do everything. And there are so many different groups and organisations and networks that all want to do something. If we can play to each other's strengths, then we build that beautiful mosaic of everybody kind of pulling together in the same general direction. And I think one of the things that some of us in infrastructure and membership bodies are thinking, well, there's a couple of things. Firstly, how do we support our members who are directly impacted, whatever way that may be? Now, that's bread and butter. That's what we do. So we simply pivot some of the work we do to be reactive to the particular context in which we're working, but that's normal. It's same as we did in the pandemic, same as we would if there was, I don't know, whatever else might happen around us. Part of our role, and I'm only speaking for Acevo here, but I think many of my colleagues in the other membership bodies would probably agree with me. Part of our role is to support the sector. And I think we have to be very clear that we don't have the remit, we don't have the resource, we don't have the capacity to try and change the world for everybody, but we do need to do what we can to protect the sector. I think in that context, we're starting to explore a little bit, what do we see that has happened elsewhere in the world, particularly in the US, where measures have been taken that are directly impacting on the non-profit sector over there. What do we need to be thinking about here to make sure that we are protecting our sector's ability to keep doing the work it does, particularly given the crucial role it plays in community cohesion, in supporting people and so on and so forth. We're thinking about that context and whether that's around regulation, whether it's around law, whether it's around culture, whether it's around protection of civic space in its simplest definition, I guess. And I think those are the areas that, for me, those sort of broader sector things, and that's where I come in, and that's where my colleagues come in, and that's where other membership bodies come in as well, because that's the space that we can be focusing on.
Going on what you were just speaking about there, in terms of what you do at Acevo, could you just talk about how you adapt to the fast-paced nature of change and how to know when to respond instantly and when to wait, and if you have any examples of that?
I wish I had an easy answer that I could bottle, because as a membership organisation, you literally don't know what's going to land in your inbox next. I can give you one example. We haven't seen it in the most recent budget, but the previous budget with the news about the national insurance contributions, I remember, and I will be really transparent about this, I had an email from a member about 4 days before the budget saying, we're hearing about this, we're really worried about it. What's Acevo going to do about it? And I went back and I said, I'm not really sure, we'll have to wait and see. You know, Acevo's not really about budgets and commissioning and income. There's other organisations in our sector that really specialise in that area. We're all about leadership. Wednesday afternoon, my inbox was exploding. I mean, really exploding. It was like, right, okay, yes, this matters. We have got to deal with this. We've got to respond to it along with our fellow infrastructure bodies, as we try to do. In broadest terms, I think part of my job, and again, I think it's part of the leadership role, is to just take that beat and to step back and say, is this something I need to react to straight away? Or is this something we need to take some time to think about? And any members listening to this who receive I do a weekly newsletter, and I frequently talk there about the challenges that come. And I think it's a very real challenge now, because we are so much living in this world where there's the immediate crisis, the next issue. We become hypervigilant. So you react to something as though it's this big issue, when actually perhaps it isn't. And somebody said to me very recently, I was saying something about, it feels like the hand grenade going off, or the next bonfire. And they said, well, how do you know it's a hand grenade? How do you know it's not just a puddle that needs mopping up? And I thought, that's a really good question. And you have to step back. And I think that knowledge about when do you step in, when do you not, when do you react, I suspect anybody listening to this who works in a frontline charity, running a food bank, supporting people who are homeless, whatever it is it might be, they'll be incredibly familiar with that tension. When do you use your resources and your capacity most effectively? How do you do that most effectively? And when do you have to say, actually we can't do everything. And that's a big challenge for our sector, I think.
Very delicate balancing act.
Very delicate balancing act.
Well, Jane, it's been such a pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you very much for coming onto the Third Sector podcast.
It's been a joy. Thank you very much indeed.
We hope you enjoyed our discussion with Jane, and that's it for this episode. Next week, we'll be joined by the Chief Executive of the People's Postcode Lottery. But for now, from Dami and from me and from all of us at Third Sector, thank you for listening. Our studio producer is Jude Owen.